Okay, welcome everyone to NJBIA's Public Policy Forum and the Political Roundup panel. I am Ben Dworkin, and I will be playing the role of moderator in today's panel. I am the director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship at Rowan University. I'm very excited to have this privilege of kicking off this panel. So thank you all for being part of today's discussion. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. Complete biographies, bios for the panelists can be found in the speaker section of the event webpage. There will be time set aside for questions at the end of the panel discussion. So if a question comes to you, by all means, send it to us through the question chat feature, and we'll do our best to get to it. We are recording this session, so if anything happens with your technology, please know that we can get you a recording of this once the session wraps up. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. We have with us today one of our nation's leading pollsters, Patric Murray, director of the Monmouth poll at Monmouth University. Thank you so much, Patric, for being here. We also have two outstanding national political consultants with decidedly Jersey roots, Mike DuHaime from Mercury Public Affairs and Julie Roginsky from Comprehensive Communications Group. Mike, Julie, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, so let's begin. Here, we want to just jump into the presidential election. This year's presidential election had the most votes cast in any election ever. Mike, let me just go to you first. Could you discuss, from your perspective, the results of the 2020 election at the national level and in New Jersey specifically? What I'm looking for, I mean, we all sort of know what happened in terms of results for the most part, but did anything surprise you?
Well, I think the thing that I take away mostly, we're also focused on the presidential election. I think what I took away is below that, if you include what happened in the presidential election and look at everything below it, you kind of have a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what happened. Obviously, Democrats won the big prize. President Biden won by as large amount as since FDR being Calvin Coolidge. So a huge amount of victory for President-elect Biden. However, you did see Republicans hold the Senate, kind of against all odds, pick up seats in the House. Also, Republicans picked up a governorship, and Republicans picked up 3 state legislative bodies. So in a year that I think many people anticipated a blue wave, it kind of stopped at the top of the ticket. And I think voters were looking for divided government. In New Jersey, you had, I think, fairly status quo. We had 2 state legislative elections that were special elections where Republicans held off stiff challenges in a difficult area in District 25, where Donald Trump lost by double digits, and certainly Senator Booker won, but Tony Booker was able to win. And on the House races, you had essentially somewhat status quo. Certainly the Kaine-Malinowski race was very close, and I think most people did anticipate that being the closest race of all. But for the most part, New Jersey was somewhat status quo, and I think the rest of the country really looked to have divided government. I think this was a repudiation of Donald Trump personally, but not any kind of endorsement for kind of any left-leaning policy. I think it's very much a center-right election with a repudiation of the person at the top.
Julie, let me go to you next. The same question, just what was your take on the results of the 2020 election, and did anything surprise you?
Well, I think Mike, raises a good point. I'm kind of tired of constantly saying that Mike raises good points, but he does. Look, this is a repudiation of Donald Trump. This is not a repudiation of even Donald Trump's message to some extent, which is troubling to me on many levels. As somebody who obviously cares about the country and is a Democrat, it's very troubling to me. But what you saw across the country is that there wasn't much penalty for siding with Donald Trump, for being allied with Donald Trump from an ideological perspective. There was just penalty for being Donald Trump because people were tired of his antics and tired of his personality. But what I saw, which was contrary, and I'd love to hear from Patric about the polling situation, but what I was surprised to find on Election Day is that, in fact, you didn't have this mass repudiation of all the people who enabled Donald Trump. Trump could not have gotten away with everything he got away with, in my opinion, and what the voters soundly rejected, had he not had allies, had he not had Mitch McConnell, had he not had a Republican Senate, had he not had allies in the House to help him. But in fact, those people got rewarded. You saw that people like Susan Collins won, and not by a small margin. Certainly Tom Tillis won by margins that we didn't anticipate. So that to me was troubling, and that to me forestalls any kind of reckoning for either side. What you basically see is that you're going to have much more of the same going forward. You will have a Republican Party that sees no political interest and no political benefit to working with President Biden. What they see is political benefit to obstruction, because that's going to get them, they believe, and they may not be wrong about this, bigger gains in the midterm elections in 2022, and potentially a return back to the White House in 2024. Something that we've seen since Barack Obama's first term, when Mitch McConnell said that it was his interest to make Barack Obama a one-term president. The other thing that troubled me tremendously, and something that I've been banging the drum on for my own party here in New Jersey, but it was also very apparent around the country, is that we need to stop treating our quote-unquote base voters like they are in the bag for us. They rightly, I believe, and when I'm talking about they, I specifically mean African Americans, but really Latino voters especially, are people who need to be courted and need to be persuaded just like everybody else. And I think you saw really a signal in the message that was sent to the Democrats nationally by communities of color to say, hey, stop taking us for granted. Don't think we're going to just turn out because you want us to turn out. We want to be appreciated and we want to be courted just like everybody else. That is a message that is something that I strongly urge people in my party to take seriously, to listen to carefully, both Governor Murphy when he's running for re-election next year, and certainly members of Congress around the country in the midterm elections, and governors around the country, because what you saw is not one gain by Democratic governors in any state house this year, not one gain in terms of numbers in the House of Representatives, and the Senate did not flip despite all the numbers that we saw. That is largely because I think we sometimes take our voters for granted and don't necessarily remember that they are to be appreciated and they are to be persuaded just like they deserve to be.
Julie brings up a great point about turnout. I want to just mention one thing about turnout. We saw in 2008 record turnout for President Barack Obama, and there was a great effort by Democrats in the following years to bring voters back out who showed up for Barack Obama and hadn't before. I think as John Corzine found out 1 year later, and Democrats found out 2 years later that didn't happen. He had incredible success personally, President Obama, and he obviously got reelected fairly in 2012. After his 8 years in office, Republicans got the White House, the U.S. Senate, the House of Representatives, had more state legislatures than ever, and more governors than they had in 100 years. So the hard part, I think, for Democrats and Republicans when they look at this super high turnout is how do you translate that? A lot of that was Trump energy, both against and for. And how do you translate that into the next year in New Jersey and the next 2 years nationally?
Yeah, Patric, you obviously look at these numbers. So if you could, just what's your take on the 2020 election? What surprised you, and any reaction to what Julie and Mike have offered so far to this discussion?
My surprise was, I think, the same thing that Julie and Mike have mentioned, which is how Democrats down ballot did or didn't do. Their lack of success there, considering overall what had happened at the presidential level with this extraordinarily high turnout. Now, obviously, pollsters are on the dock right now because of an expectation that Joe Biden was going to do better. But it's actually the private pollsters who are polling all these House races across the country. The polls that you don't hear about that were driving an internal narrative among the campaigns that Democrats were going to pick up seats in the House, we're going to flip the Senate, all those things that we don't see, that confirmed what the public polling was basically telling us what the general direction was. And one of the things that I look at when people ask me, okay, so what wrong is polling broke? Can you fix polling? I'll never look at another poll again. By the way, that's the person who says that to me is the first person who will look at the next poll that comes out tomorrow. But what we're finding is 2016, we had a little bit of a problem. We looked at that. 2018, we didn't have a problem. And 2019, we didn't have a problem. 2017, we didn't have a problem in all those special elections and the gubernatorial election. And then suddenly in 2020 rolls around, we have a problem. And then I did a poll right after this, right after the election, and suddenly everything looks fine. I mean, in terms of people who told us who they voted for, they lined up with Joe Biden ahead by 4 points. And suddenly it seemed to be something that happens specifically with Donald Trump. And I think what we saw in the polling is indicative of what we saw in the actual election results, which was there was just a reaction against Donald Trump, but not a huge one. And many people have bought into the underlying message, the populist authoritarian message that he has been putting forward, and that helped down ballot Republicans do well. Those did well in terms of Donald Trump's coattails. Plus, most of them ran ahead of Donald Trump for people who wanted a divided government, figured Joe Biden was going to win and so forth. See, that combination, I think, made it very successful for Republicans down ballot, but also sent that message that, as Julie mentioned, and we're seeing it in the polling, that you basically can get away with undermining the norms of political behavior or constitutional behavior. We had in the poll that we did post-election, 37% of Americans believe that Donald Trump has done more to protect the Constitution than past presidents. Protect the Constitution. That's just slightly below the number who said he's undermined the Constitution. And when you look at constitutional norms, certainly, and nobody can hold up the past 4 years as a high watermark for that in any administration. So the whole framework of what we view as acceptable in politics has been changed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump might not be president after January 20th, but certainly his impact will live on in these results. And I think Julie is right in terms of the behaviors that we'll see coming out of the Republican Party in working, or more specifically, not working with President Biden.
Mike and Julie, I just want to stick on polling because, Pat's the expert and we should, but from your perspective, you guys both, work with closely and advise different campaigns on each side of the aisle. Were the internal polls that you saw just as far off in the end as the public polls seem to be in terms of these congressional races and Senate races?
I would say some of the down ballot races had issues, but the Trump campaign had internal polls that were much closer to the final outcome. They were very close in all of these states, much closer than a public poll. Now their methodology might be different. The questions they ask to try to figure out how undecided voters are going to break, or someone who says they're undecided really is voting. Their internal polls were much closer to the final outcome. But I do agree with Patrick on some of the down ballot races I saw looked more dire for Republicans than the ultimate outcome was.
I'll tell you what I found, and Patrick, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but what I found recently, and this doesn't just encompass Trump, it really goes back a couple of cycles, what I found much more useful than polling and horse races are actually focus groups. Because it is in focus groups that you see people's attitudes, and you can kind of extrapolate where their head is. So, I did focus groups in New Jersey, not me personally, but I witnessed focus groups in New Jersey going back to before Trump came down that escalator, that presaged that quote unquote Trump voter here in New Jersey, not around the country. And if it's here, it's certainly on steroids and other places that are much more competitive on the presidential level. They didn't say that they were voting for Donald Trump. This is before Donald Trump ran for anything. These were actually Democratic voters or Democratic leaning voters who were talking about issues that Trump then harnessed in a very likely way. And I would love to go back to that particular cohort. I don't know if we can recreate it now. It's been so many years to see how they voted. I suspect most of them did vote for Trump despite their party affiliation. And so, what I found is that if you're talking to people and you're actually taking the time to understand their concerns and understand where they're coming from and actually give them an opportunity to speak rather than asking them yes or no questions or sort of open quoted questions, you will have a much better sense of where the trends are. Now, it's not going to help you with the horse race that everybody looks at religiously to find out how we're going to do, next Tuesday. but it does allow you to establish trends and establish metrics, and allow you to understand where there are trouble spots for you and your party. I mean, I'm sure the Republicans might do the same. It allows you to do that. You know, had we done that before Chris Christie ran, and I don't know that the Corzine campaign did this, but had they done it, I'm sure they would have probably seen a sense of Christie's strength in early 2009 that might have not been reflected in the polling that you see, either public or private. And I don't know what the Murphy campaign is doing, but I'm sure, and the Republicans who are planning on running against him, but I'm sure that they're probably seeing signs that we wouldn't see. For example, Patric, you did a poll tomorrow saying, you know, Phil Murphy versus Republican X, you know, Jack Ciattarelli or John Bramnick, whoever ultimately is the nominee. So to me, that's much more beneficial, and it really does help me as a consultant understand trends in ways that polling no longer does.
Yeah, just to weigh in on that, before every election, every big election, presidential elections, I actually go out and do qualitative research,
Right.
talking to voters one-on-one. So I'm out in Iowa and out in New Hampshire at the beginning of these presidential primary processes. And absolutely, what I hear on the ground turns out to be an accurate depiction of the narrative that ends up coming out of that election. The problem that we've had is we haven't been able to accurately measure that in the polling, in terms of the numbers. We know that it's out there, and so I actually look to try to measure those things. And one of the things that we heard a lot of from these voters who had switched was saying that there were more Trump voters out there. The shy Trump voter that many believe to have existed in 2016, which really didn't exist in large enough numbers to actually affect the polls. That wasn't what affected the polls in 2016. I firmly believe affected the polls this time around. 2020 was different, and that's exactly what I was hearing from voters a year and a half ago when I started, starting out on this process. Was that there are more of them out there, that they're worried about, now that Trump's president, they're worried about talking about him in their workplaces, those kinds of things, but they're going to support him. And I knew that it was out there, and I was asking questions to try to get at it. But what I think we're finding is that if those people won't pick up the phone to even talk to us, it's not a matter of them lying to us, we will never capture them accurately in terms of polling. And that's why one of the things that I said, and I've been on the record many times before this election, saying I'm looking at the polling, I'm looking at my own polling and what I'm doing, and I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised anywhere from a Biden landslide, but to Trump squeaking it out. There was enough uncertainty in the polling there that people should have actually been looking at the range of possible outcomes rather than trying to take a single average, something like that.
And that was the Trump campaigns, what they were trying to do. They firmly believed from day one, this was a 4-year strategy. If you look at Trump and how he behaved in office, their belief was not that they were going to go back and get middle of the road voters who maybe didn't like Trump to change their mind. Now, they probably had opportunities to do that they missed during the pandemic, but they firmly believed for 4 years that they were going to grow their number. They believed, as Patrick just said, that they were going to find voters who didn't vote in 2016. And remember, the Libertarian actually got more votes in 2016 than the Green Party candidate. There was a lot of focus on her, Jill Stein taking votes from Hillary Clinton, but there were a lot of votes out there that they felt they could get. They believed they could mine the right. And all candidates, whether it's pollsters or campaign operatives, we tend to mistakenly run the last campaign instead of running the one that's in front of us, and we learn lessons from that. And it's hard to poll if you're polling people who are likely voters and then 15 more million people vote than voted last time, right? Because they're not in your universe of people you're talking to or mailing or polling. So it's an interesting phenomenon that I think both parties and pollsters are going to have to deal with going forward.
I want to try and shift us now to talking a little bit more about New Jersey, but by way of doing this, of connecting these two sections about the presidential race and then the upcoming governor's race, I wanted to ask you this, and Julie, let me go to you first on this. How is state politics going to be different once President Trump is in Mar-a-Lago full-time and not the White House? Let's assume that's going to happen, but how is that going to affect state politics from, at least, how do you see that shaping the way things will play out over the next year or so?
By the way, I'm going to make a prediction, and I'm 50% convinced I'm right, but maybe not. Trump's going to go to Mar-a-Lago for Christmas and never come back. That's how he's going to leave the White House. Look, the beauty of our communication system is that Trump could be Mar-a-Lago, he could be on Mars, and he could still tweet every day, and he still has a rabid following that will take what he says seriously. Our state politics will both help and be, I think, hurt. Well, I shouldn't say our state politics. I believe that our political infrastructure for the Democrats will both be helped and hurt by what happened. It will be helped, obviously, in that the governor has a strong partner in Joe Biden. Joe Biden has a very strong affinity for New Jersey. We've always joked for the 30 years that I've been involved almost that he's New Jersey's third senator when he was in the Senate. He spent so much time here, obviously, because of Delaware's proximity, but he was kind of the South Jersey senator for all these years. And so obviously, look, things like the Gateway Tunnel, assuming Andrew Cuomo doesn't really throw a wrench in it, will be benefited tremendously. If there is any possibility of a bailout for the states, which I don't think there is because of what the Senate is up to, but it will obviously be helped because Joe Biden's in. And so there will be deliverables for the governor to point to because he'll be able to work with Joe Biden, Gateway being the big example there. It's also very perilous. Donald Trump has been an incredible foil for our party for all these years. Look what happened in the midterms in 2018. We won every seat but one in 2018 on the congressional level because Donald Trump was such a great foil. People like Tom Malinowski, Mikey Sherrill, I mean, literally either defeated or drove out incumbent, long entrenched Republican incumbents because of that. Josh Gottheimer was able to hang on in a pretty conservative district because of that and has only strengthened himself. But now that Donald Trump is gone, and this is exactly what happened in 2008 when Barack Obama defeated George Bush, there'll be no boogeyman. There'll be nobody to blame. And Mitch McConnell doesn't make as much of a convenient boogeyman as Donald Trump does. People just don't know him as well. They don't have the visceral reaction to him that they do to Trump. And so now it's really up to the governor to try to get reelected on his own terms and with his own strength. He's been helped tremendously, obviously, politically by the COVID crisis. But again, that's something to think about a year from now. And times can change and there'll be nobody to blame or to refocus attention on, which I think provides an opportunity for Republicans in ways that I think, again, Patrick, you tell me, but polls today don't reflect. When you guys do job approval numbers for the governor, his numbers are obviously very strong. But I don't know that that reflects the danger that always arises for Democrats, for Democratic governors, whether it was Jim Florio in '93 after Clinton got elected, or it was, again, it was, obviously John Corzine after Barack Obama got elected. You see this trend continuing to happen. And I think that's something to bear in mind. New Jersey voters are really, really, really fickle. And they are so fickle, in fact, that we've never elected a Democratic governor for a second term since Brennan Byrne. And that's something, again, to consider, which is why I go back to and I plead, with my party, do not take our base voters for granted. We cannot do that. We saw, by the way, Latino voters in New Jersey also trended towards Trump tremendously in this election. It doesn't, I think that was partially because of Trump. I think it was partially a political awakening and a maturation saying that we're not going to be taken for granted. And, African-American voters, from what I've been hearing, are saying the same thing. So we need to really redouble our efforts in making sure that though there are a million more Democrats than Republicans in the state, we need to very much make sure that we continue to not take them for granted.
Mike, let me go to you. And there's a lot that Julie touched on. We're going to try and get to bits and pieces of it, but I want to stay focused on this question. What kind of role does Donald Trump still play in New Jersey politics? How is he going to affect New Jersey politics if he's still tweeting, if he can still have a rally, if he can still effectively, does his endorsement in a New Jersey primary, Republican primary, effectively close the door to anybody who doesn't get the endorsement? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump could make or break a Republican in the primary next year. It's a little different at the state level than at the federal level, but there's a reason during all of this kind of crazy talk about this contested election and fraud that the only Republicans really speaking up about Donald Trump and pushing back are state elected officials. The federal elected officials, the U.S. senators and members of Congress, are saying almost nothing except for a few exceptions because they know for their own political Harold, Donald Trump just got 74 million votes, whatever it was. He's got a gazillion Twitter followers. He could make or break people in primaries. So I think he could, if he chose, to endorse somebody next year, could really make that person. Now, Donald Trump has not done a whole lot that's outside of his self-interest. Every once in a while, that self-interest coincides with the party's interest as well. But look what he's doing in Georgia right now. None of it has to do with what is good for the party winning the U.S. Senate seats in Georgia. It's all about his own self-interest. But in terms of the long term, I think Julie's really right in that Democrats have benefited greatly in New Jersey from Donald Trump being president. The congressional delegation was 6-6 before Donald Trump, and then came 11-1 after 2018. I mean, if that's not, an indictment of how he was, the visceral reaction that people had in New Jersey to him, I don't know what is. I mean, the congressional delegation was 6-6 or 7-6 for one way or another for decades before Donald Trump, and suddenly it's 11-1 now. The demographics are changing in New Jersey. It is becoming more liberal. It is becoming more diverse. It is, becoming more dominant in terms of a million more Democrats. But that's a dramatic shift. And I think from a public policy point of view or political point of view going in next year, Governor Murphy has a very convenient foil right now and can blame Donald Trump, for just about anything he wants. And people will agree with him because he's, largely, at least by the majority of people, not liked in New Jersey. Bill Pascrell tweets about Donald Trump 15 times a day, blaming him for everything. So, I mean, at some point, when Joe Biden's president, there's no one to blame anymore. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be punished. If you do a great job, that's great. But it is now on you if you can't get it done. Right now, Phil Murphy can take credit for what's been good and for the most part blame Donald Trump for what's bad. Next year, he's not going to blame Joe Biden. If he does, that's probably not good for his party. So I think they own it a little bit more. And all the Democrats who won in 2018, they've had a chance to be reelected, which is very good, but they're going into a redistricting process. Their districts could get more competitive in a time where you're going to have a midterm party and you don't have Donald Trump as a foil anymore, and you own it. You own what the party does. People found out certainly in 2010 that was very difficult shortly after a big win by Barack Obama. So I think that's how New Jersey could be impacted. Certainly, I think Governor Murphy and Democrats in New Jersey would love it if Donald Trump stays active and tweets nasty things about them. They would love it because he's a much better foil than any Republican in New Jersey. I don't think he'll stay that active, but who knows?
Patric, let me shift this a little bit. I mean, obviously, and Julie references the Governor Murphy's approval ratings during the COVID-19 pandemic have gone up, as they have for a lot of governors who have been working their way through this crisis. And presumably this bodes well for his reelection, as does Governor Murphy's ability to self-fund in a state that's very expensive to advertise on television statewide. Murphy has strong support from the very energetic progressive wing of his party, and seems to have been able to cut enough deals with Democratic power brokers to avoid any real primary. So my question for you is this: if we start to come out of this pandemic by the summer, as recent headlines seem to indicate we could be emerging from this, on one hand, you would think that this could hurt the governor because his high approval ratings, when there's less of a crisis, could drop to more normal numbers. On the other hand, we could see a surge in economic activity because people are just ready to go spend money and do something outside. And so it could be a boon for economic growth in New Jersey and jobs. So what are you expecting to see in next year's race for governor? What's it really going to be about, and how vulnerable is Murphy once we start emerging out of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, we simply don't know because of all the caveats that you just mentioned, Ben. Because one thing that will probably amaze people is, as all-encompassing as COVID is right now in our lives, as soon as we have workable vaccines and reach herd immunity status where we can get back to basically normal life, people will move on to other concerns very quickly. And you think that, oh, this is something that's going to last in people's minds forever. No. So, and we have, Dr. Tony Fauci saying that he thinks it's possible by the third quarter of next year, so that by the end of the summer of next year, that we could be at that stage. which would mean that the 2021 gubernatorial election could be about something entirely different than what it would be if it was held today. And we don't know what that difference is, because it could be that we didn't emerge as strongly as we could have economically, or we did economically, or it could be simply that everything's back to normal and now New Jerseyans turn their concerns to more typical issues such as transportation and property taxes and those types of things, which would give an opening for a Republican to step in and change the framework of the conversation from what it would be today. So we really don't know. So, and that does mean that there is a vulnerability for Phil Murphy, but there's no way to predict it. What I think is he should be doing right now is thinking about that coalition that he would need in normal times to win an election, and doing the kinds of policy activities that you need to do to build that coalition, which I think, as Julie keeps pointing out, is not taking your base for granted. Which, by the way, in New Jersey, if you have your base, I mean, you win by double digits. We haven't had an election where Democrats have overwhelmingly outperformed their voter registration advantage. Since going back 2014, Democrats have been winning by double digits since then. But if you look at voter registration, it's pretty much their margins are pretty much in line with voter registration. This year, but Joe Biden won by a couple of points above that. Bob Menendez 2 years ago, facing some ethical challenges, a couple points below that, but have all been hovering around 14 points since 2014. So it only takes your base right now to win in New Jersey unless you really screw something up. And so right now we don't look like we're on a trajectory where Phil Murphy is going to screw something up. But as I said, we could come out of this and it could be an entirely different ballgame. We don't know that.
In my opinion, Ben, it's all economics. I mean, when Republicans win in New Jersey, it's because Democrats screw up on economics. I mean, ultimately, Republicans can win a place like Middlesex County or Gloucester County where you have conservative working class Democrats who switch party lines. It doesn't become ideological. We haven't won a U.S. Senate race, Republicans, excuse me, haven't won a U.S. Senate race in New Jersey since 1972. But at that same time, as Julie pointed out earlier, we've had 3 two-term Republican governors and no 2-term Democratic governors since Brendan Byrne. It is economic. And I think what happened with John Corzine, we had double-digit unemployment, and he was a guy from Wall Street who's supposed to be able to do better than that. And Governor Murphy is from Wall Street. And to the extent that there's controversy around what's going on with COVID, it has to do with schools and with businesses. There was a report out yesterday saying nearly a third of New Jersey small businesses have closed and are not reopening this year. I don't know that people blame him for that, but I think they will be upset if it doesn't come back. There's for all the progressive ideology that he puts out there, that becomes more of a federal issue. The voters in New Jersey are more ideological when it comes to a U.S. Senate race than a governor's race. Governor's race is all about the local economy, taxes, property taxes, jobs. That's why Governor Christie was able to beat Governor Corzine. It's why Christie Whitman was able to beat Governor Florio. It's a pretty simple equation. If Democrats do not go too far to the left on economic issues, tax and spending issues, and borrowing $4 billion to cover everyday expenses is part of that. And I think if Governor Murphy has a vulnerability and if Republicans understand how to prosecute a campaign, it's going to be on those economic issues.
Julie, I want to sort of touch on something you referenced because it relates to taxes as well. Earlier in the discussion, we were talking about how a Biden administration might be able to help a Murphy administration in this election year. And you talked about the potential for a gateway tunnel, finally putting shovels in the ground, which would be a tremendous economic engine. There's obviously the opportunity, or the potential at least, for stimulus aid with direct aid to states, which will help make it easier to pay back some of that $4 billion they just had to borrow. I wanted to ask you, Julie, first, what about the SALT cap elimination idea? We understand that the Congress, then the Republican Congress, imposed a cap on your state and local taxes that you could take off your federal taxes. And this affected particularly high property tax states like New Jersey. is that something that could in effect be eliminated? The cap be that $10,000 be eliminated, which would in effect, or at least could be argued by Democrats, is a tax cut that they were able to partner with the Biden administration to help provide. Do you see any possibility of that?
Well, that would be up to Chuck Schumer to really drive as the Senate Minority Leader. He comes from New York, and obviously New York is tremendously affected by the SALT cap. Look, I think the SALT cap is a long way away from being repealed, because I think you have Republicans who traditionally have no reason to help states like California and New York and New Jersey that have these high taxes, and progressives who will say you're taking money to help the wealthy. I mean, don't forget, $10,000 is a pretty high deduction for people. Most people don't have that kind of deduction. So you have a combination of interests that I think are not rushing to repeal the SALT cap. Look, the problem is this: if you're in Bergen County, which obviously we know is the key county and has only gone, I think, Mike, did Christie lose Bergen in 2009, but one, I think he was the only, I think probably the only statewide
Yeah,
governor.
that's correct. The first time that ever happened. Yeah.
But traditionally, Bergen, as goes Bergen, so goes the state. Bergen County obviously has high property taxes by nature of being close to New York City and having an affluent base. You're getting your property tax bill next year, and then you're getting that combined with the fact that you're not getting a deduction. Are you going to remember that it was the Republicans in Congress who were leading you to have higher taxes, or do you associate taxes with the administration here in Trenton? I mean, that's the difficulty for Democrats consistently, and it goes back to what Mike said. Traditionally, fiscal issues are the purview of Trenton Democrats in people's minds. And I see that again when I do focus groups. You ask, who's responsible? Is it your school board that's responsible for your high property taxes? We'll take 9 out of 10 times, yeah, it is the school board, right? They don't think of it that way. They don't think of it. It's the municipal government and sometimes the state government in their minds who are responsible for why their property taxes are high. They don't blame the school board because they barely know who their school board is, and they barely vote for the school board, I mean, typically. And so that's the difficulty and the challenge that Democrats, as Mike pointed out, will have next year. You raise a good question about SALT. SALT is something that we cannot do anything about. There's not one Democrat, starting with Phil Murphy on down in New Jersey, who doesn't want that cap repealed. But yet we are probably going to have to bear the brunt in voters' minds of why their taxes are not going down as a result of the SALT deduction.
Mike, let me turn to you, because I want to touch a little bit more on the governance race, and then we're going to jump into the topic of redistricting. So, Mike, the question I have is, being the panel's primary Republican here, who's going to run against Phil Murphy, and how are they different from each other? I mean, is one going to be more of a Make America Great Again kind of candidate? Is one going to be more of a never Trumper type of candidate? Are they trying to ignore Trump completely just to focus on Murphy? I mean, I'm sure they all are, but how are these Republicans going to be different from each other, and who are we even talking about?
Well, first, you've got Jack Ciattarelli, former assemblyman from Somerset County, who ran in the 2017 primary and lost to Kim Guadagno. 2017, he ran kind of an anti-Trump, anti-Christie kind of race, really, and partly because he was running against Christie's lieutenant governor. That didn't work. I mean, Christie did not have high approval ratings then, but he still did among Republicans, and just like Donald Trump still has very high approval ratings among Republicans. It's not really an easy path. Certainly, he ran and won in a competitive district in general elections. Doug Steinhardt, I think many people think will likely run. He's the current state Republican Party chairman. He has been the closest kind of Trump ally, I think, that I've seen of the people who are potentially going to run. So I think he is one who could certainly very credibly run as kind of the Trump person in New Jersey. Now, his record in New Jersey Republican politics long predates Donald Trump, so he certainly could stand on his own 2 feet well beyond that, and he's done a good job as state party chairman. But I think he's the one who kind of most closely aligned with the National Republican Party. He's been very loyal and faithful. He had campaign manager Bill Stepien and the deputy campaign manager for the Trump campaign, Justin Clark, on the phone post-election to talk about the legal strategy with Republicans in New Jersey. So he's the most closely aligned with Donald Trump and his team. And then the third person who may run is John Bramnick, the assembly leader for the Republicans. And he is somebody who runs in the most difficult election district in a general election. He's somebody who wins in a district that Phil Murphy won, that Joe Biden won. It's a very difficult district, and he won last time against a lot of money, fairly comfortably by 6 or 7 points. So he is probably, I would say, the best general election candidate, but is also more moderate than the other candidates. And as Julie or Patric will tell you, that is not always easy in a primary when you're the most moderate person. And he's also one of the few Republicans right now to speak up about Donald Trump misleading people about election fraud. And I find that incredibly admirable. But there are Republicans who don't like that, clearly. But I think he would be a very strong general election candidate. So all three of them are a little bit different. But I would say if you asked about the kind of Trump question, I think Chairman Steinhardt really is probably the person who embraces that the most.
Is there anybody else, and this is throwing open to all three of you, is anybody else besides Bramnick, Cettarelli, and Steinhardt that we should be looking to or perhaps hearing some noise from in the future?
Well, it's getting late in the day. I mean, when I first met Phil Murphy, we first talked about him running for governor potentially. That was 2013, right after the Christie reelect. And then it took him the ensuing 4 years to get elected. So if you're not out there already talking to county chairs, talking to county committee voters, talking to Mike DuHaime, I don't know who that would be. Because
Bob Hugin is somebody who gets mentioned a little bit. I think Republicans look at Bob Hugin, who ran in a difficult year and spent $40 million running in Donald Trump's midterm election, feel like maybe just the timing just wasn't right to run in that election. And somebody who spent that kind of money with a business background could be back. I don't know that he's going to or not, but that's one other name that you hear from the businessman self-funder world.
Okay. Patric, let me go to you. The voters this year approved a constitutional amendment that would delay redistricting for the upcoming election, as well as those in the future, if census data from the U.S. Census Bureau is received after our February deadline. And this affects New Jersey because we have these off-year elections. So right now, it looks like the Census Bureau isn't going to make that we won't get our numbers until May, potentially. So the question I have for you is, what are the implications right now over the next 2 years? Are we going to have legislative races in 2023 using the current, in 2021 using the current lines? Should we expect we'll have legislative races in 2021, but then we're not going to wait till 2023? Are we going to have a special issue of having 2022 legislative races because we will have the census data by that time? How is this going to play out? Is it going to be 21, sure, 22, or 21 and then 23?
Yeah. So it's going to play out. There's no special election. The maps will be drawn by March of 2022, but they won't go into effect until the regularly scheduled 2023 election. So there's not going to be a special election, which means the 2021 legislative elections will be held with the current map. I'm kind of ambivalent and was ambivalent on this amendment because I fully understand why you would want to hold off if you're not going to get your census data on time, of trying to push something through very quickly, because you want to ensure that you have enough time to consider communities of interest, all those things that the tiebreaker in this on this commission should be considering. But having said that, the date of February 15th is just way, way, way too early. We could have easily, Virginia is in the same boat that we are. They have their legislative elections in and gubernatorial elections in a number of years. And they always hold their primary, or they move their primary from June to August in redistricting years, and then move it back to June for the rest of the decade. So it would have been easily doable to say set that date rather than February 15th to somewhere even mid-April, and still have enough time to run the clock normally on a primary that would be held somewhere in mid to late August. It was just a matter of convenience for the powers that be, and the Democrats in particular, to say, hey, we don't want to change our June primary date, therefore we're going to set February 15th as the date, which, by the way, was missed two redistricting cycles ago. We got the data in March, which was more than enough time to, we pushed back the primary 3 weeks back in 2001. So, or 11, 2011. No, 2001.
2 primaries.
Yeah, the time's rolling on. So, so this is problematic. I've been pushing for much more significant reforms that almost look like we were going to get them, a change in the commission structure, as well as in the criteria that's used by the commission for legislative redistricting. That almost looked like it was going to be sponsored and move in the legislature, and then COVID hit, and then that blew it all out of the water, and then suddenly this amendment emerged. You're worried that the administration, the Trump administration, might have pushed what could be bad data very quickly. But of course, if they do that, they would push it before January 20th anyway, so it would be before the February 15th deadline. So barring a federal lawsuit against this, and it has to be a federal lawsuit because now it's a constitutional amendment in our state constitution, barring a federal lawsuit that says that this is unconstitutional or it's against the Voting Rights Act and so forth, that this is what we're looking at, having this map in place until 2023.
Mike, you wanted to jump in?
Sure. I just think it's a great power grab by the powers that be. Let's not kid ourselves. The 4 of us could get in a room and draw a map in a week. That would be fair. We got to the moon, 50 years ago with less technology that's in my phone right now. These maps can be drawn. Patrick makes a great point. You could move the primary later in the year. You could move it to September. New York has their primaries in September for local and state elections. There's no reason it couldn't be done. It is not just about keeping Republicans out of power. It's about keeping Democrats from facing primaries and having shifting districts where there might be powerful Democrats in certain areas that could amass areas to primary current Democrats in power. So this just gives 2 more years of the status quo. And anybody who pretends otherwise, just don't kid yourself. It's fine. They put on the amendment, people voted for it, but let's not pretend we can't draw a map by next year. That's not true.
Well, we can, let me jump in because I actually was fairly involved in this amendment. You can draw a map by next year. Mike, you and I can get together today and draw a map. But people like Patrick want and demand and expect and should expect public hearings, public input. So we can't just draw it in a day and have a tiebreaker break it because you want input from the state. You want input from people around the state. Second, I'm not surprised Republicans want an August primary. It tremendously depresses turnout. I don't know what happens in Virginia. Everybody's down the shore here in New Jersey. Or otherwise traveling in August. So you in a primary for legislative districts, which are low to begin with, you'll have, I don't know what percentage of people voting, that is fewer than in typical primaries if you have it in August. If you have it in September or even in August, what it does is it benefits tremendously incumbents because you as a challenger, or by the time you're done with your primary, are going to have 6 weeks potentially to compete. Never mind that absentee ballots by statute, I believe, or maybe even constitutionally go out, I believe it's 8 weeks or so before an election. So the point is you need to really, you'd have virtually no time to campaign before those absentee ballot, vote by mail ballots go out. And there's all sorts of problems to having this pushed back. And I will say that the thought for this, and as one of the people that was working on this, is that there's hope and sincere hope that Joe Biden will, I don't know what his powers to do this might be, but will go back and say, wait a second, we need a more complete census. You didn't have enumerators going out for the most part this past year because of COVID. So you had 3 issues happening. COVID prevented enumerators from going to hard to reach communities. Lo and behold, of course, those are typically Democratic, quote unquote, base vote communities. I'm not surprised Republicans don't necessarily want them counted. But the reality is we had a very abbreviated count because enumerators couldn't go out because of COVID. We had Donald Trump scaring the bejesus out of people who were not here, who were not documented immigrants, by threatening to ask citizenship questions. And frankly, if I were an undocumented immigrant living in New Jersey or anywhere in the country, I'm not so sure under the Trump administration, I'd fill out my census even though it's the law. I wouldn't risk it because I wouldn't trust that Trump wouldn't do something with that information that would put me in harm's way. So with all of those things, and then of course Trump abbreviated, the third part is Trump abbreviated the census despite the Census Bureau's request. They wanted it pushed back to next June. he cut it off in October, not even in November, which is what the Census Bureau originally intended to do. So you had an abbreviated census, and that's the census that you want to actually go and create districts with. Well, who does that harm? Of course, it harms hard-to-reach communities. And those are the communities that are growing. The Latino community is expected to grow tremendously. If we don't count them appropriately, they're not going to see the representation that they are entitled to see. The South Asian community in New Jersey is growing exponentially. If you don't count them, and they're hard to count, typically harder to count than white suburban voters, they're not going to be represented. So you would screw them for the next 10 years if you were to go and do this with the census data that Donald Trump wants to give us. And that was exactly the motivation behind this. Does it help Democrats? Only in the sense that Democrats represent much more diverse coalitions and frankly, communities of color. And that's who that would have harmed if we had done this the way Republicans would have wanted it done. Not to mention, we do need input from the public. We do need hearings. We can't get into a room and draw this all in 5 seconds with, my cell phone here. We'd have to actually have input from people. So that was the thinking behind it. It was not a power grab, unless you believe that having representative democracy and ensuring that we have a complete count of communities of color.
That's not what I believe. I'm telling you, in April of next year, if Joe Biden's president and you take an extra couple of months and you feel like you got everything right and you got the numbers in April next year, you could have time. Legislative leaders from both sides that come in. New Jersey has a pretty good system of bipartisanship and a tie-breaking member. If you wanted to have public input over the summer and you wanted to have a primary in September, nobody's saying it's ideal, but if you wanted to have elections in 2021 under a new map, you absolutely 100% could. There's no question about it.
You need to send out absentee ballots. You need to send vote by mail ballots out, I believe, about 2 months before the election. So you're having a primary.
A dozen states that do primaries in September, then are they disenfranchising people for the last 100 years?
They have different laws about vote by mail. In New York, where you have a primary in September, since you mentioned it, doesn't have an automatic vote by mail. You have to actually request it. And so the problem with vote by mail, and you have to have a good reason for it. It's not like you just show up and you say, I want to vote by mail, the way New Jersey does. New Jersey is much more generous. So you'd have an election, the day after Labor Day, you'd have candidates campaigning in August. I don't know who they're campaigning around. And then immediately, a day or two or a week potentially at the most, after those ballots go out, you'd have people voting. Well, I've never met Mike DuHaime. I don't know anything about Mike DuHaime, but I've met Julie Roginsky. She's the incumbent. I guess I'll just vote for her. It's a complete incumbency protection racket if you do it that quickly. That's the problem.
We are, we're about 5-6 minutes.
I love hearing these guys talk about how much they are supporting challengers.
Both Mike and I worked for a lot of challengers over the years. If we weren't able to defeat incumbents, we wouldn't be worth the money that people pay us. So I don't have a problem with challengers at all.
I want to talk about voting while we have about 5 minutes left. I want to offer for those who are watching, if you've got a question, throw it up. We'll try and take an extra minute and give a sort of lightning round answer to any question that's submitted. But just because we brought up voting and any of these topics, we keep going. There were significant changes in how we vote in New Jersey this year, with the emphasis on vote by mail and by emphasizing it, the distribution, the without request, the simply mailing of vote by mail ballots to every registered voter, over 6 million of them in New Jersey. So my question, Patric, let me get you in here so that just because you have some thoughts on this, I'm sure. Was this a positive thing, the way we ran our election in 2020? Was this positive for democracy? And do you expect these changes to stay in place in a post-pandemic world? And in fact, are there going to be even more voting reforms? If people have talked about same-day registration, early voting, in-person voting, what's your take on how it worked and what might the future hold?
Excuse me. I think the verdict is still out on exactly how it worked. We did better than some states, like, for example, New York, September. That's why Mike mentioning New York and its September primary. I wouldn't hold up New York as any any exemplar of how to run an election right now, as we see the problems that they've had with this particular vote by mail election. But I think, in New Jersey, it seemed to go all okay, better than some, worse than others. You know, in states that do this really well out in the West, you know, they built up to this over a number of cycles. So, you know, there's a lot of bipartisan support for these vote by mail elections out in Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah. And it's because they worked out the kinks. We had to try to work out the kinks very quickly, and I don't think we've quite done that yet. We don't have a full report yet on how many ballots were rejected. We don't have a, you know, ballot harvesting problems. We don't have a full report on, you know, how much that happened. You know, some states forbid that entirely, like Arizona, don't allow anybody else to carry the ballot at all. You know, we still don't have a full sense of how this is run, but how well this did. But we don't have a lot of out and out complaints about it. In New Jersey. We don't have a lot of reports that there were significant issues of fraud or significant issues of disenfranchisement. And that suggests to me that this is the direction that we're going to continue to go, that I would expect to see early voting. I would expect to see early in-person voting, and I don't know whether about same-day registration, but you know, a whole host of other reforms that will effectively move election day from being election day to being the period before that.
Yeah, Julie, I'm going to come to you because it's one of the things that's been said that I've echoed is that we no longer have an election day. We have an election. It's just a giant period of time, and election day is when we try and make sure everything's in by that point. Or at least submitted by that point. So, Julie, your take on the way we ran elections in New Jersey this year. Do you expect it to be the same? What's the future hold for how we run elections?
I suspect we'll have early voting going forward, where people could actually go and vote in person. A lot of people I know, look, I had friends who hesitated. It wasn't explained to them that vote by mail was actually the best way to vote this year, because you would vote provisionally if you showed up at the polls. This is all stuff that they don't really, nor should they be expected to really get. This is not what they do for a living. So I had friends who actually were like, wait a second, I want to go vote on election day. And I kept saying, if you really want your vote to count on election day, you should vote by mail. But I think there's still that culture, and especially among people who've been voting for decades, that they feel like they want to make sure they want to go, they want to push the button, they want to pull the lever, whatever they want to do to make sure that their vote physically counts in their mind. So I think for those people, you'll have an expansion of early voting, where you'll be able to go to a voting center and do that. Now in New York did try that this past cycle. It was kind of a debacle because the Board of Elections in New York is so incompetent that there were lines, I think, for hours and hours and hours. But I think that if you have a dedicated early voting system set up, that will probably be a good complement to vote by mail. Look, I'm all for making it as easy as possible for people to vote legally, of course, because it is when you enfranchise as many people as possible that you are able to actually have democracy at its most robust. So, and I'm hopeful that the legislature will move to pass early voting, and the governor is going to signal, I think, that he's going to sign it if they do that.
Yeah, I don't think we go back. I think we'll have plenty of convenience voting now. I don't think we'll be mailing live ballots to everyone, because that will be confusing if you reinstate in-person voting, whether it's early voting or election day voting. I don't think you can be mailing live ballots to 6 million people. And there were some problems with that this year. Not to say anything was intentional. It's just the nature of the voter rolls. But I don't think you go back. I think Republicans should embrace that. We should want more people to vote, and we should just go at it, win that war.
Yeah, I think this election showed that when more people vote, Republicans don't suffer necessarily from that, which has been the urban legend, I guess, all along. A couple of things that this changes is the campaigning process. You have to campaign earlier. You have to you have to send out your final message has to occur weeks before election day, because people are voting at that point. The other thing, though, that I think we might want, one of the reasons why it's possible we might still send out live ballots to everybody if we can do it correctly, is New Jersey needs to change its voting machines anyway. I mean, all our voting machines in all our counties don't lack security. kind of security need. They lack the paper trail that's necessary, like what Georgia did in its recount. Every ballot has a paper trail to it, so even the ones that are cast in person. So this was the first election where we had a paper trail in New Jersey for all our ballots since we've gone to these machines. So it saves. It's going to cost a lot of money for each election to do this, but it saves money in terms of having to replace all the voting machines, which is something that we've been needing to do for years here.
I want to. We could keep going, obviously, but we've hit our mark in terms of the time we have allocated for this particular panel, and I think just in sum, as we talk about the state of politics and the state of our democracy, we should recognize that 73 million people voted to re-elect Donald Trump, more than almost any other Republican, and over 10 million more people voted for him 4 years ago, and 80 million people voted for Joe Biden. And so this kind of citizen participation is what is so critical to making sort of fundamental to making everything work, as is the work of all three of our panelists. Julie, Mike, Patric, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. Thank all of you for watching. Hope you enjoyed yourselves, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.